Welcome to MICE. It's almost over. Welcome to the last panel of the weekend. And thank you for coming. I also want to say thank you to Lesley Art and Design, our host, supplies the walls and floors and many other things, for the 10th year in a row. And I would also like to tell you that MICE is presented by the Boston Comic Arts Foundation, or BCAF, which is a 501c3 charitable organization, which we started a few years ago so that MICE could be a nonprofit, but with the grander name and a broader mission than just MICE, the mission of encouraging, supporting, nurturing independent comics and independent comic artists in the Boston area and beyond. We're supporting and assisting a couple of newer shows, including the Boston Comics Kids Fest, which will be having its third annual edition this spring. The Comics in Color Festival, which will be having its first annual edition in April 2020, and Podtails, which is actually a dramatic podcast expo, which is having its first ever show right now next door at Lunder. So if there's time after this panel and you want to run over and you like podcasts, that'll be good. And we welcome donations to BCAF. To help with all of this work, go to miceexpo.org or talk to somebody at the front desk after the panel. Help us help comics. And if you're really ambitious, you can even be a MICE sponsor and sponsor a panel like this. So with that said, let's go on to the Library is the Place for Comics panel. And our moderator, A. David Lewis.
Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope that was applause for Dan and not applause for me, because you haven't even heard what I've said yet. Yes, hi, I am A. David Lewis, and I'll be your moderator today, and I am sick. So because I'm Muslim, this is probably the closest I'll get to alcohol all year. Thank you very much. I'm ready to go now. I'd like to thank you all for coming to Libraries, the Place for Comics. I'm excited that this panel could be included this year. I've had the honor in previous years to host a number of panels on graphic medicine, on religion, and I have to tell you, this one might be nearest and dearest to my heart. I'll explain that momentarily, but first I'd like to introduce these panelists to you, starting with Robin Brenner, ladies and gentlemen. Steve Weiner, hello. Sean Smith, yep. Oh, Sean gets the applause, good. That's nice. Robin and Steve, we'll talk later. Matthew No. I love spatterings of applause. And Kara Dzindolet. Hello. Our panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Now, just point of personal privilege, I want to take a moment to make a confession. Wow, that came in big. These are all trained and employed librarians. I am not. I, in fact, am a library addict. And this started at a really young age. My mother introduced me to it. I'm sorry to say. She took me down to the children's room almost weekly. And from there, I started experimenting in middle school and high school with all sorts of sections. I looked at atlases. I went nonfiction, and I even thumbed through the reference section. On a more serious note, want to say that I'm excited to be moderating this panel because I do feel genuinely that libraries are the litmus test of a society. They largely reflect what a culture, what a group, what a community values, what they want to share, what they want to endorse, and the people they want to bolster. So I'm going to pose a few questions to the panelists, and then of course we can open it for conversation. But I do want to note that at the outset, the question isn't how or why comics are in libraries. Now, the question has always been for me since I was a wee barn, what took them so long? And now that they are there, what can we really do now that they've been properly or more readily accepted in a number of contexts? So, having set that stage, I'd like to ask each panelist if they would briefly talk about where they're employed, what their library home institution is, and briefly how it represents comics. Steve, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm Steve Weiner. I'm the director of the Maynard Public Library, small library west of Concord. And I've been collecting comics for libraries for 30 years. I started at the Expo.
We're going to boost the volume on you there, Steve. Hang on 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Thank you to Lesley University for supplying these mics. We will turn them on now. Sorry to have interrupted you, Steve. Please go right ahead.
No problem. So as I was saying, I started collecting in 1989 at the East Branch in Somerville, and that directly relates to your question about what took so long. But after a few years, I started writing about comics and libraries in library publications, and I did that for a number of years. And that was a really interesting experience because I got pushback from both the comics community and the library community. But eventually, they kind of came together about 2000. I was one of the people that planned the 2002 Yalta conference that brought Neil Gaiman, Art Spiegelman, Jeff Smith, Colleen Duran to ALA. And that the PLA also had a conference that year about comics, and that was kind of the turning point for libraries. That's the way I look at it. And we're still buying them now. And the focus has really changed because initially the focus was on getting popular materials that would attract boys. And as you know, the industry has changed. And now so much material for girls that we're turning back to trying to find ways to bring boys back into the library to read comics. So that's kind of my short story.
Thank you, Steve. Matthew?
Hi. Can I just hold this? Is that fine?
You can hold it.
Otherwise,
you want to walk around?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
So I'm Matthew No. I work at Cantway Library, which is the library that serves Harvard Medical School, the School of Public Health, and the School of Dentistry. The other question was about what we do with comics? Yeah.
What would you say characterizes the collection at your library in brief?
So you probably wouldn't expect to find comics at a medical school, but that's changing. So there's this emerging field and genre thought of as graphic medicine. So these are comics about medical topics, health topics, public health, dentistry, so on and so forth. And so we collect these comics. I try to buy as many as I can. I bought probably a dozen here at Mice today that'll be in that collection soon. And it's probably like 300 comics now in the past 2 years that we just collect to try to get students thinking about health topics in a new way. That we encourage students to create their own comics so they can share their struggles and tribulations working through the field of medicine. So, yeah.
Thank you. Robin.
All right. I'm going to see if I can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I'm the teen librarian at the Public Library of Brookline, and we have collections of graphic novels in every age range in the building. So we have kids, tween is a new section, teen, which is me, and adult. When I arrived in Brookline, I was immediately asked to help them start up their adult graphic novel collection at the time because they had one, but it was very small. And then over the years, we now have our library director is a huge graphic novel fan, and she took over the adult, and I stick with teen and help a lot with children's. I am part of youth services, so I see how comics go amongst the youngest readers all the way up through my age range, which is 8th to 12th grade. So there's a big range that I deal with and see. I've also done a lot of work with the cataloging of the graphic novels over the years. We just did a big change in our building and things like that. So it's making sure people can find what they're looking for, making sure everything is visible and available and findable by the public. But we're obviously a public library, so that's a different mission than some of the other art libraries on the panel.
Yeah, and I'll just add, and I mean, Sean will be able to elaborate on this. We did try to collect a range of librarians here from both public town libraries, private university libraries, and in fact, one topic we can get into during the Q&A, there may be members here from elementary, K-12 libraries, and we want to include that in the discussion. So sorry, Sean, I didn't get to, did I call you Steve a second ago? No. Can we rewind the tape? Did I call him Steve? Okay. Sean, please, if you would.
Hey, my name is Sean Smith. I'm the Outreach and Public Services Librarian at the Boston University School of Theology Library. So if I had to describe this Boston University School of Theology, it's probably a little, it definitely has a social justice focus to it, and it's probably a bit more progressive than your probably stereotypical seminary would be. I don't think that's super controversial.
Not at all.
Louis would agree with that. And we have sort of I'll call it niche because it's very kind of limited, it's a religion and graphic novel collection that is named the A. David Lewis Religion and Graphic Novel Collection. And that's something where when I started at the School of Theology Library when I was an undergrad, and I was so drawn to this collection. It just seems like kind of welcoming, I guess, you know? So I started freshman and undergrad. I'm born and raised in Boston, and I see this collection. I pick up Battle Pope. Kirkman's Battle Pope. And, I was like an altar boy growing up, and I read this, and I was just like, what is going on here? And I've kind of been in love with that collection ever since. And one of the... I am now a full-time librarian there. One of the things that I pushed for is I wanted to see such a something that I feel confident saying there's not a lot of seminary theology libraries that have these collections just kind of hanging around there. I wanted to put this front and center, so we now have it right in the front of the library as people walk in, and it's sort of united as a collection. And it's amazing to see. It's like it did for me. It stops people in their tracks. It gets people thinking differently. It expands sort of what people's ideas of what scholarly resources or whatever is. It kind of shakes up your stereotypes when you walk in, and that's something that I think's a really valuable addition to our library.
Sean, can we also specify, I did not ask for it to be named after me.
You did not.
I did not. I was also worried it was going to be the A. David Lewis Memorial Collection.
We'll get there.
Okay. Oh, gosh. Kara, if you would do the honors.
Hello. I work at MCPHS University. We're a health sciences school with a big focus on pharmacy. I am also the volunteer self-appointed comics liaison for the library because we've been developing a graphic medicine collection with a grant that David received, which is new to our library this year. So it's pretty recent that we've been working with comics in a large way, but it's been very exciting.
Thank you, Kara. And obviously I've stacked the deck. Let me start with this question, and Robin, you sort of touched on it. I want to come back to you and open it to the whole panel. Can we start with a success story? Can we talk about an instance that any of you have had where a patron of any age has either come looking for comics or did not realize that you had comics, that they wanted comics, and you feel you served them by attracting them to this collection, by putting them in touch with this material?
I can do two really quick ones.
Yeah.
When I first was helping to start the adult graphic novel collection, this was in Lexington, where I worked previously. So this must have been around 2003, maybe. And there was some resistance to establishing an adult collection. Children's and teen made sense to people, but everyone was like, I don't know that adults are going to want to read all these comics. And what we ended up doing is in our branch library, which was like a little mansion. It's a very tiny library next to a Waldorf school. And we had a lot of regular visitors there. And we got, I believe, 15 graphic novels and stuck them on a shelf and this was the testing ground to see if they would work. And what I delighted in seeing is that our senior population were the ones that came in and were like, oh, look, you have comics. And we're very excited and took out every single book we had because, of course, they grew up reading comics. And it was something they hadn't seen in the library. And people forget that, comics were enormous during their childhood. My dad learned to read with comics. So there's a lot of kind of awareness of every audience is interested depending on their experience, and it just takes some exposure. The other one I have is just a mom and her teenage daughter. And her mom came in despair in a way that I am very familiar with about how her daughter didn't enjoy reading and had never read a book on her own, never finished a book because she just wasn't interested. And we had, through the course of having about 15 minutes of discussion around what kinds of things she was interested in and what kinds of stories she liked, I gave her a pile of graphic novels. And her mom was a little bit like, I don't know about this. And then she came back the next week and said her daughter started reading the graphic novel, and I honestly don't remember which one it was. I would know it was realistic fiction style. But she read the entire book in one sitting while they were away on vacation and then immediately asked for more. And her mother was almost in tears. She was just like, she's never done that before. She's never finished a book. She's never even been interested. And that underscores, for me, the purpose of a library for teens and kids is to let them have that experience, to understand what it's like to love what they read, to love what they've chosen, that they get to read what they are interested in. And to understand why reading is such a magical thing. And for a lot of people, reading comics is the way to get that feeling first. And we have a lot of people that are skeptical that if you read comics, you won't read anything else. That is never true of any comics reader I know. They read everything. But I think that kind of mission is very important for my public library work, is to get kids to understand and to get their parents to understand that reading for your own pleasure, for your own choice is extremely important, and it opens up worlds to you to do that.
I'm going to be a bad scholar here by not citing my source because I don't remember it. But I believe there's been data actually showing quite the opposite. Comics readership, comics literacy does not prevent or limit prose or poetry or playwriting literacy, but actually enhances it. I think if there is any challenge, it's making sure comics aren't left behind as a juvenile form, because that's the way many people may have come in, but maintaining it into their other forms of literacy. Yes, there is no danger in exposing children to comics. It will only serve them well, and hopefully it serves them as adults as well. Did anyone else want to share an early success story? John?
This was actually earlier this year. We had our library or our school has a pretty diverse population. I was telling Kara this story earlier, so she already kind of got the gist of the story. But we have a pretty diverse population. That includes people that might not necessarily be religious or atheists and stuff like that. And I had someone come up to me at the reference desk and kind of this person told me, in a moment of confidence, I have ADHD and I've actually never read the Bible, and I've never I feel a little like kind of out of place here that like I don't have that type of reference. And our reference desk is right by the religion graphic novel collection. So I walked him over there, and he was immediately drawn to graphic novel, the Manga Bible. And the look on his face where it was just like every librarian sort of has like every so often one of those where it's just like, you done good. And you connected the person to the resource they needed. And that's sort of something that's like kind of really stuck with me, in all honesty, as like kind of a success story for the collection.
Matthew, we were talking before the panel today, and you brought up the subject of manga, of comics format based in Asian, Japanese culture, and which is sometimes, if it is translated into English, may be reversed or seen as reversed from traditional Western English-speaking audiences. You suggested that there might be a challenge there for libraries? Or am I misquoting you horribly?
Not misquoting horribly. Can I answer your other question first, though?
No.
The success story?
As moderator, yes, of course. Please do, and we'll get back to the manga question in a moment.
So it's actually 1.5 success stories.
1.5. Okay.
So the full success story is, so we recently at Countway did a series of programming around Suicide Prevention Month because burnout in medicine is a major, huge issue, and medical students have a much higher rate of suicide than the average population does. But so we did a series of book clubs, and one of the book clubs that we used, one of the books we used was Hyperbole and a Half. And this book, it was so relatable for this group that in the discussion room, people felt comfortable enough opening up about their own struggles with depression and anxiety in a way that we don't normally get to see in med students because they're kind of afraid to show vulnerability because they're judged on this constantly. And if there's a question about whether you can handle it or not, you may not get to move forward in your career. So that's the success story, even though it's a little depressing.
Okay.
The half piece is that I managed to convince a medical school faculty member that's like, why do you have graphic medicine in the medical library? This is a place of study. I convinced them that it was valid by showing them an academic comic that recently was released by Elsevier, which is this major like conglomerate academic publisher. So it's half a success story because the faculty member came around, but I have questions about, major presses taking a role in a field that's generally been about like deconstructing this narrative. So
I want to jump right into the next question, but I don't want to ditch the manga question.
Yeah.
Did you have a thought on that before I open?
So the manga one, so I wonder about it. I have questions about it from a public library standpoint, but from an academic standpoint, it causes sometimes some cataloging questions for us in particular because most of the things in our graphic medicine collection are single volume works. Manga is almost always our manga are long series, and it causes issues in our catalog sometimes because they want to get cataloged as like a serial, but we need them to be discoverable as a monograph, and it's this mess.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Robin, did you want to add to that? I saw you nodding your head vigorously.
As a longtime manga person, and also having dealt with that question many times in the library, and if anyone wants to know, I can talk a lot about the recent cataloging decisions that we made in our library to make it a lot simpler, both for the actual catalogers and for the public to find what they're looking for. But manga has always been, in a funny way, actually easier than some of our other comics because we just have a series title and the volume number, and that's good. And they're all the same size, and we can put them on the shelves, and like everyone is used to that. And most people don't know manga as much by creator, they know it by the title. They come in and ask, I want to read Naruto, or I want to read 20th Century Boys, or whatever it is they're looking for. Some, of course, know the creators, and that's easy to find for them. But the other thing has been that manga, the being flipped or unflipped doesn't matter to anyone anymore, especially most fans prefer it to be unflipped. I very rarely see manga that's published in the kind of English manner anymore, just because it's more expensive. That's the bigger thing. But it's easier to just publish it since it was published that way in Japan.
Let me open the question to Kara and Steve also. Kara, you're having to make actually cataloging decisions right now. You're purchasing things here at MICE that might not come with ISBN codes, that may be floppy, that may be a different size. I'd be interested in your challenges now, and Steve, how you've negotiated similar either format or crediting challenges at your own library.
So our collection is still pretty new. We really just did the bulk of our ordering, and we're getting ready now to kind of put it out for the student body to use. So we were just discussing in our library the question of kind of how to catalog them in the best way. We're not necessarily concerned with having like a full Library of Congress call number, but I was trying to have a discussion with one of our cataloging librarians who's worked in libraries for decades about kind of how do people know and find comics. As Robin was saying, is it by the title? Is it by the series? When we have kind of standalone graphic novels, it's been a little easier because often there's just one creator involved. But trying to explain, so we have a couple trades from Spider-Man, from Mighty Thor, I think we have a Superman, as to how a reader would find them, what they would be looking for, if it's by the writer, if it's by the artist, explaining that there might be multiple artists on a run, even collected in one trade. So we've kind of just started addressing that question in terms of how we make them accessible in that way.
Okay.
And with the least amount of hassle for us and for people looking to find a specific title.
And Steve, what about your institution?
Well, we try to keep it as simply as we can. So most things are cataloged by the writer or the cartoonist if it's a writer-artist, and then the title. And most things are cataloged as a YA collection, which is inaccurate, but it makes it easy to shelve them, and it makes it easy for everybody to find them. So that's pretty much what we do, and it works very well for us.
Excellent. Now, let me just shift gears slightly here. We're at an excellent weekend-long event here at Lesley University, the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo. In your opinion, or rather in your experience, how are comics factored into, or even likely benefiting your own event planning at your institutions? Matthew, you touched on how you've done used comics in workshops related to suicide prevention and burnout. Has it become a useful tool or a touchstone or even a motivator, an engine for events and more widespread community involvement?
I mean, my library, we're very keen on featuring comics when we can. Some of it's very simple. It's passive displays. It's making sure comics are included in every display we put up. That they don't have to be a special comics display. They can fit into any, genre that you're recognizing or topic or whatever your displays may be. And I think we're lucky enough that we work with local bookstores, and if anyone comics creator is coming around, then I can usually poke them and be like, hey, let's host this person and have a nice event. We've had some extraordinarily popular creators come through, like Raina Telgemeier was probably the biggest a number of years ago. To the point that there was a little girl who was 8 who ran up and kissed the poster when she saw that she was coming. It was very cute. I had to explain to all my colleagues though that Raina was like a rock star to like 8-year-olds everywhere, and they were all like, "Oh, really?" And I was like, "Yes, you don't understand." But we've also had, for example, we had. Jim Ottaviani come and talk about when he wrote Feynman, which is the biography of Richard Feynman. And that was an interesting night for me. My parents are both physicists, so that was one of the graphic novels we actually read and reviewed together. And then that audience was very, very different than the audience we normally see at public library events. It was mostly men, mostly older men, who were interested in physics and science. And that was just something that made me really happy to see, because it was an audience that stereotypically public libraries actually have a hard time reaching.
Well, thank goodness we're bringing men back to the library.
But yeah, it was great. And I think anytime, it's considered just like everything else. It's like anything that'll be exciting that our public is interested in. And they are definitely interested in comics.
Yeah, so we're trying to do more of those book discussion kind of programs, because comics are, I don't like harping on the comics for an accessible thing, but in this case, it's something that our med students actually can find time to read, because most of the time it's fairly quick. But then, like, we've hosted authors. We have an ongoing author series at the medical library, and just in the spring, right? We had Rachel Lindsay here, creator of RX, come as a joint event with Harvard and MCPHS, and that was very well attended. And we record these things and put them out there, so it's kind of showing. It's an opportunity for the people on campus to be more engaged. But if we can record them, we can get a wider audience and get that creator's voice out there as well. So it's kind of mutually beneficial.
And because you bring up Rachel Lindsay, I do believe that she's speaking this coming week in Connecticut.
Darien Library, yeah.
Yes, at the library there. So I think these grow on each other. I think this has momentum that is very attractive also to creators and to publishers. It does have an air of authenticity to it and authority that, in my experience at least, benefits everyone. But I hope the panel shares that feeling. I think I know the answer to this. Oh, yes, Steve, please.
I just want to follow up on what you said. The graphic novel, the public library market anyway, is becoming a bigger and bigger component of the publishing market.
Yes.
Depending on the individual publishers. For example, Dark Horse, it's about 12% of their market right now. It's the public library market. And when they design a book, they design it with librarians in mind to make life easier for us to catalog them and to purchase them. And then you get to smaller publishers like NBM, for example, and it's about 24% of their market. So this is the market that first of all, they didn't really acknowledge exists, because initially they thought that if a library bought a copy of Mao's, say, and 50 people took it out, that was 50 copies of Mao's they didn't sell. And over time, they understood that was actually an advertisement for their own product. But the library market has become a very stable market for comics.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And Mouse, I think, was one of the earliest mainstays in a number of library collections. I remember seeing it when I was growing up, next to Peanuts and Garfield, and then Mouse. And because many people didn't know any better, I discovered very quickly that it was cut of a different cloth. So, Steve, you already touched upon what I was going to get to next. What do libraries offer comics, either as an art or an industry? And I think we're starting to touch upon, there's a built-in sales base there. Are there any? And there's opportunities for artists and authors to come by. Are there any other elements that we want to highlight?
I will say that what I always say about libraries is, for the long time within the kind of history of comics, people could find comics in a lot of places. It used to be you could find them in the grocery store, you could find them in the corner store, you could find them on the newsstand, in the newspapers. I was a kid who remembers growing up and reading all the strips in the newspapers, and then slowly graduating to, I think I had a ridiculous number of Garfield books, because I love all cats. But then what was interesting to me is that I've seen, since I've been involved with comics and libraries, I've watched it happen, whereas as soon as you got libraries to have comics on the shelves, that to me is how most people find comics now. If you're not already a comics reader, if you don't have an adult in your life that brings you to a comic book shop, which is now a very specialty niche place to go, then you will find them in the public library. And that's where you see people. It used to be, 10 years ago, you'd also see people like lying on the floor of Barnes & Noble reading all the manga. But at this point, libraries have become the place where people, especially kids, if you watch them, to them, there's no difference between anything they're reading. They just love everything. And when they read comics, they certainly love comics exuberantly, but they don't think of them as something special or something different. It's just another kind of story that they love. And the more they grow up that way, the more they'll take that with them as they grow up. And they won't see a difference. Like, why shouldn't they read comics as they're a teen, as they're an adult? Why should it be a separate thing? So I think for me, it's very much that that is the place now where people discover comics first when they're younger, and honestly when they don't have as many stereotypes or prejudices that have been brought in on what they're supposed to be reading.
Yeah, Kara.
Touching on what Robin said, just personally as a fan of comics, as she mentioned, like going to your local comic shop, that was something that seemed very intimidating to me.
Yes.
Because I wasn't familiar with the setting and I wasn't sure how welcome I would be there. So as someone who was already going to the library, that was a kind of nice bridge to get comfortable with comics, feel like I had a little bit of an idea of what I was talking about, and then transition to a local comic shop to kind of keep up with current titles. They are very friendly. I promise you will probably be very welcome there, but at first it was a little intimidating, so the library was a nice place to kind of test that out.
And to add to that, Kara, at one point they were not. I mean, I think that maybe comic shops have grown more aware of the variety of their clientele, but there were a number of shops that were very much boys' clubs, and very much hetero boys' clubs, and very much cisgendered hetero boys' clubs. And yeah, Matthew.
So maybe this isn't something that, as I'm sitting here thinking about this, like the public library offers something to cartoonists specifically as a place they can come and maybe do the creative work and find reference material. That way you don't have to, buy everything. Reference materials can be obscenely expensive. And just library as a free open space you can be is something that's disappearing, and you can always be in the public library. You don't have to have a purpose or reason, but if you got one, great.
It may have come straight from you, but over my social media feed recently was the note that libraries are one of the few and vanishing spaces that you can go publicly and are not expected to spend money. And that is getting rarer and rarer. So on the subject of money, and Sean and Kara, I don't mean to lead you here. Obviously, this is open to everyone. Without disclosing numbers or any sensitive information, how is funding for comics acquisitions budgeted at your respective libraries?
All right, I'll start. Our collection got off the ground based on a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on your part.
There were no tears.
So
it was just blood and sweat.
The school theology library and Dave received a grant through the BU Center for Humanities to get our collection off the ground. And since then, I would say that in terms of adding to that collection, it's something where it's hard to spend a ton of money on that collection. As much as I like to advocate for it, and I think everyone here would agree that the budget belt's getting tighter and tighter, so it's limited, but we still will be purchasing, especially if we get suggestions from any sort of. We've gotten suggestions from our patrons. We've gotten suggestions from you as well, and that's one way that we try to build it up. So it's sort of like kind of a little bit patron-driven in that sense. We are lucky enough to you haven't forgotten us, which we're eternally grateful for. And every couple of months, I'll get a phone call saying, "Hey, do you want this?" And I'm like, "I absolutely do." And that's one way that we're able to continue to build our collection as well. So it's due to the budget realities, it's not as we're not building it as much as we would like, but we're getting there slowly but surely.
I feel I should qualify, though, that usually I'm just dumping stuff on Sean that I got for free otherwise. That I'm not this fount of charity. And how have you dealt with other financial budgeting around comics at any of your libraries?
I mean, in my library at this point, graphic novels are part of our budget every year for each department. But I will say that just thinking of a couple of hurdles along the way. For example, when I first started in Brookline and they asked me to help with the adult graphic novels, they kind of approached it by saying, well, we have them, but they're not as popular as we were promised. It was kind of like we were told that if we got graphic novels that circulation would go up. And then I finally realized that they had only ordered official award winners of graphic novels, which are certainly valid and things you should have. But at the time, they didn't have, for example, The Walking Dead, which was the most popular comic for adults in the world. And so there was a lot of kind of that sense that they should be only collecting officially approved comics and not treating it like every other collection in a public library and going by circulation and going by what our patrons would ask for and what is popular. So I immediately was like, all right, well, they set aside a chunk of a budget to give me to restart that collection. And I went in and bought all of the popular things that they should have been buying all along. And immediately the collections just went whoop, and started circulating. So for us, it is almost always by circulation. But you can argue with our head of collection development anytime you need to restart a collection, redo a collection. He's very willing to listen because graphic novels circulate enormously. For example, our new tween librarian, so she serves 5th to 7th grade. And she got a whole new collection this last year because she just built the room. But then this current year, she has a different budget because it's smaller because she's no longer building the entire collection from scratch. But she suddenly went, I was really hoping that I'd be able to really boost the superheroes because we didn't have enough superhero comics when we started, and the kids are really clamoring for them. And so she went to our head of collection development and said, I need to do this. The kids are asking, can you do this? And he was immediately, of course, here's, I don't remember exactly how much, but here's $1,000 to boost the superhero comics in tween. So if you can make the case that you need it for your collection because that's what your patrons are demanding, then it's easily to kind of shift money around.
Okay.
As Sean alluded to, when you're funding a university collection, there's always a lot of competing interests for what you're trying to develop. We're supporting the entire school in terms of programs, and especially as a health sciences library, pharmacy textbooks are expensive, journal subscriptions are very expensive. So we had a few comics and graphic novels that had been used in classes, but it certainly wasn't something that we were able to spend a lot of money on. So with the grant that David received, it's been a great excuse for us to kind of have money that we can 100% dedicate to growing the comics collection, because there is a surprising number of comics that deal with medical issues, that deal with health issues in a number of ways. So having money that we could really only spend on that has been a really good excuse to really build up that part of the collection in a way we definitely wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Let's get to Matthew's comment, but then following that, I'd like to invite any questions from the audience in the time that we have left. Matthew?
Kind of following that, the textbooks are very, very expensive. You all have no idea. But that was part of my successful argument, is that I can buy probably 30 comics generally for the cost of a single anatomy textbook. So it's kind of, if you frame it that way, it seems like not that much money to people. So that helps in a medical setting. But then with the grants thing, can I do a plug?
Yeah, you can do a plug. Of course.
ALA now has a graphic novels and comics roundtable.
ALA being the American Library Association. Yep.
And as part of that, they administer the Will Eisner Graphic Novel Growth and Will Eisner Graphic Novel Innovation grants for libraries. So if your library is in need of a graphic novel boost and you have a great idea for maybe a specialized collection or some special programming, go to your librarian and they can apply for this grant. It's open to everyone in North America, so Canada, the US, and Mexico now. So that's my plug.
And don't be scared of the word grant. Be cocky.
Yeah.
Have the cockiness of a mediocre white man. Hello, everyone. It's a lottery ticket. And maybe you can make an excellent argument for your lottery ticket, but it is worth pursuing these things. That's the only reason I've been able to have any hand in this. So I'm sure, yes, Steve. Steve is not a mediocre white man. I was referring to myself.
I just want to make this point about the Will Eisner collection. The Eisner Foundation did this because Eisner was so dedicated to getting comics into public libraries. He, after he did The Spirit, and Spirit died out in the early 50s, he didn't go into superhero comics like one would expect. Instead, he went into doing educational comics primarily for the military for other foundations. And then when he returned to doing storytelling comics in the late 70s with the contract with God, his goal was to get comics out of the comic book ghetto and into the public libraries. That was the first place he wanted to go. And he lived long enough to see it happen, but now his foundation is making sure it happens.
That's a fantastic point. Thank you. Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience that you would like to put to any of our panelists? And certainly don't be shy. Yes, please.
I have a question about the resources that you consult for new and upcoming or just art issues that are coming out, or just what would you suggest? I have the normal ones, your general ones that we use, but I'm always looking into other independent blogs or any other places that we just look for that are tried and true.
If you don't mind my repeating that just for the microphones, the question is about what resources each one of you consult beyond perhaps the more obvious ones when building these collections, yes?
I mean, I definitely look, we have all the usual library resources of Library Journal, School Library Journal, all the places that review comics. They will never be able to review enough. That is true. So I'm always on the lookout for the blogs that I trust, the people that really are writing up their own reviews. There are a couple of institutional blogs out there, like a Good Comics for Kids at School Library Journal is edited by Bridget Alverson, which is a great resource for younger reader comics. I have my own website, actually, that oddly enough, I read the reviews on there because I no longer write the reviews, so it helps me.
Robin, please plug your site.
Yes, it's called No Flying, No Tights, and it's a graphic novel review website. Been there since 2002. Yeah, so, but I think a lot of it is also, honestly, following creators, finding out who they recommend, because creators know each other really well and know what you're looking for, and so it can really help to talk to people at shows like this and have them tell me who's up and coming that I should be paying attention to. But there's also just the general Twitter sphere, social media, kind of finding who's doing comics where. There's a lot of Instagram, etc. Out there for comics artists. So I think a lot of it depends. I always remember Tumblr is actually where I found a lot of comics for a period of time. I don't think it's quite as true anymore, but people started publishing comics there first because of the lack of gatekeepers. You can get any kind of comic. So that's how I first saw Check Please, which is just one of those comics that's now, a juggernaut. But it's the kind of thing where I'm like, okay, that's where I need to be paying attention, is where in social media spheres are comics people starting to come through. But I definitely look for advice from other creators. When I'm looking for more diverse titles, that's especially helpful because you want to find out, you find a creator who's doing a great work and then you want more of the same and you want to find out more own voices and more stuff like that, then that you're going to find it by talking to other comics creators. And publishers actually, if you poke them, basically, you talk to publisher reps and say, I'm looking for this very specific thing. Can you help me find it? They do have people that are kind of built to tell you that, and the publisher reps will do their best to tell you who in their catalog you should look at.
I want to second the plug for social media. There's a lot of bad on there, but if you, I find most of my new comics for our collections via either Instagram or Twitter, or the Roundtable has a Facebook group that's fairly helpful too. And my own website plug, graphicmedicine.org is great if you're ever looking for health comics. There's reviews and a weekly update on what's going on in the field there. And if you're there are teachers involved in this too. So there's a comic book for teachers group on Facebook, and they'll regularly post comics that I had not heard of or thought of that are history related in particular. There's a lot in that field that's growing that you won't see unless you are out there looking for it, because it doesn't always make it into the reviews. So that's a good place too.
Other questions from the audience? Yeah? Would you like to ask a question? Okay. Yes, please.
I have a question for you. I'm a cataloger, so I wanted to know if you could talk more about the changes you made.
Sure. So in my library, for a long time, when I first got there, I very much argued for cataloging the collection by title, because that is how people look for them, and that it it unnerves some catalogers because they want to do it in the more traditional way of fiction. So they're looking to do it by author. But then I've also talked to a lot of different catalogers over the years. One of my best friends from high school is now the head of cataloging in Lexington. So I often go to her and be like, does this actually make any sense? Or is this actually going to, mess up the entire library if I ask for this? She's very good at talking me down when I have big ideas. But what we finally decided to do this last year, we got everybody together who buys graphic novels, plus the catalogers, plus our director, and sat down and figured out how to make it simpler. Because we had ended up with very long call numbers that may have been helpful in some ways, but were mostly just overwhelming the ability to tell the difference between all the books. So we now have it so that in every single library in our there's 3 in Brookline, and in every age range, it's the same. So we have graphic, we have manga, and we have superheroes, or super. They have color-coded labels, so there's a G at the top, an M at the top, or an S at the top. And then the actual call number is just the title and the volume number, and that's it. So it's title, and then it's occasionally character. So Batman is just Batman. And because those publishers tend to be really terrible about consistent volume numbers and then shifting everything around, Marvel and DC are always going to be a weird pit in terms of trying to figure out how to catalog collections successfully. But it does make it much easier for our patrons. As soon as we separated out where we had the graphic and manga and superheroes, the thing I noticed the most is that the graphic novels were no longer getting lost, because if you put them in the midst of everything else, superheroes and manga are mostly series. Graphic novels are often standalone or a couple of volumes, and therefore no one would see them because they were lost in a sea of manga, and you'd be like, well, sorry. And so that's helped a lot because they've just seen them more. They're more. And then the same manga was the easiest, as I said, in some ways, because it was just easy to do by title and volume, and they all look the same, so we could put them all in consistently sized shelves. Superheroes, in some ways, are that was the longest change. So it used to be that, for example, for Ultimate Spider-Man, it would be oversized graphic Spider-Man Ultimate Volume 22, and it just became this long call number on the spine of the book.
Subsection C.
Yeah, so
616
it just
universe.
became ridiculous. So now we have the super at the top. We just have Spider-Man Ultimate Volume 23. That's it, or whatever it was. So it's just much, much simpler for everyone, and most of the readers seem to find that fine. We've had a discussion in the past about going by publisher, which is what a lot of comic book stores do, and I actually voted against that because I feel like comic book fans who go to comic book stores know that. Most of my general public does not know which character is which publisher. Yeah. So they're not going to know that, Thor is Marvel and Wonder Woman is DC. They don't actually know that. Maybe they should, but they don't. So especially little kids. Little kids will be like, I want Wonder Woman, and that's all they know. So that's much easier for everyone. They'll be able to find it. They don't have to ask any questions, and that's the goal, is transparency.
Sorry, I caught this out of the corner of my eye. Can I ask our ASL interpreters here, what's the sign for Spider-Man? I thought...
So for Spider-Man, I'd see the little kids, they would say spider.
Spider.
And then they would put up the hand like that.
Then the web shooters.
Yeah, the web shooters.
Okay, good, thank you. That's what I thought I caught. That's what I thought you were doing out there. Very good. Spider, web shooters. Okay. Since we're coming to the close of the discussion here, I'd like to pick a small fight. This is a safe space, so I feel that we can do this. We are all friends. This is more of a scrimmage than a fight. But we have public town librarians represented here, and we have college university librarians represented here. In terms of team up. In terms of the future of comics at libraries, who's the vanguard? Who's pushing it further right now, or has the capacity to push it further? I did not include this question in the prepared questions for them, so they don't know I'm actually springing this on them, but I'd like to hear who's charging forward first.
I think I'm going to take the L on it.
You're going to take the what?
I'm going to take the L on it. It's going to be public libraries, I think.
Oh, okay. So the university is saying public libraries are going to lead the way. Okay.
Don't tell my boss. I think part of it, and I think it really hit home here, listening to Robin and Steve talk, is, and it's something where I didn't, I'm looking at it kind of as an outsider too. I didn't really grow up in this, but you know, it's hard not to get excited, especially being here today. But one of the things is being able, like, doing all this work to kind of limit barriers. To like, it's like going, like, I could never walk into a comic book shop because I would have no idea what to do. I'm sorry, I don't know the difference between DC and. But
you are still welcome here.
I know there was like a thing between Sony and I don't know.
Okay.
But with the public like the work that I see like my colleagues at public libraries do to knock down like barriers to access, it's just, I mean, I hope I do the same thing when it comes like to academic libraries, but you know, it's kind of I guess inspiring for me to see. So
Matthew, do you want to take the win, or what are you going to add?
No, I'm also going to take the L, just because the public library has a reach that I am never going to have. The public library sees probably more people in a month than I see in a year, just maybe more than that even. And it's just because they're reaching more people, they're going to be able to do more for comics, maybe in the like reach sense. And also the people going to the public or the school library may eventually wind up in, you know, institutions of higher education. So they're coming in based on what they saw in the public and the school library.
Yes.
So they're kind of setting the standard for us.
And as I noted at the outset, one of the voices we don't have represented here are the K through 12 librarians at schools, who would be a strong voice in this discussion as well. Steve, did you have a comment?
Well, I was going to say that it's a very difficult question to answer because the mission of the public library and the academic library is so different.
Very true.
Where if the mission of the public library, generally speaking, is to support a wide range of materials and to introduce people to different kinds of comics, which is what it's really good for, because once you get very specialized, you have to go to other sources generally. But the mission of the academic library is to encourage a specific kind of learning or a specific art form. And public libraries may not have the budget to really pursue that. So I'm going to say both.
Yeah.
Oh, that is very chivalrous. Very good.
I was going to kind of say the similar thing, because I think we have the breadth, but I think the specific collections, like both of you guys have been talking about, are what are going to keep the more independent comics, more the kind of the kind of people who are focused on what they're talking about, which is great. But again, you're precisely right. We don't have the budget to collect everything, and especially if it is a niche audience. Yeah, and I think that's the thing, is like you might have a library that specializes in something specific in the public library world. You know, my library collects a lot of Russian and Chinese, for example, because that's our community. But at the same time, you know, that is very specific to us, and graphic novels should be, involved in that. But yes. I think that's very different than focusing in on a discipline or a kind of comic. So I think that's great.
And while we discussed manga, we didn't get to discuss bande dessinée from French. We didn't get to discuss Dutch comics, foreign language comics. Dan, can we discuss that next year? Can we come back? Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you to our panelists today. Have a great afternoon. Thank you all very much. Can we get a picture? If you want one. Yeah, come down for flyers if you'd like one.